Hello and welcome to the Consistory of the Coelc YouTube channel. I'm your host for this video, Reverend Jake Zabel of the St. John's Evangelical Lutheran Church located in Dalby, Queensland, Australia. Now in today's video I want to talk about polyandry. And for those who don't know what polyandry is, this is the opposite of polygamy. So polygamy, multi-wives, polyandry, multi-husbands. So polygamy is when a man has multiple wives, and polyandry is when a woman has multiple husbands. Now this actually is a question I've been asked, because in the past I've done technically maybe three videos on the topic of polygamy. I talked about in my original video about what was the Lutheran perspective on polygamy, particularly what did Luther and Melanchthon and the other reformers teach on polygamy. And I pointed out how Luther, commenting on the polygamous wives of the patriarchs, that Luther said he could not condemn it, but he would not ever recommend it. So for Luther, polygamy was definitely something that was discouraged and never recommended, but it wasn't necessarily condemned. And then I did a second video where I followed up on this topic of going, look, polygamy is what we in theology call a social evil, not a sin. That is, it is a bad thing, it's something we shouldn't do, it's not the way God intended us to live our lives, but it's not something that is considered sinful and we're damned to hell. And I bring up this point of going, well, what do you do if you have couples that are polygamous? Maybe in, like, say, an African culture, an Asian culture, or some culture where polygamy is still valid and still part of their culture and is legally recognized, and then they convert to Christianity. Or what do? Do you ask them to divorce their second wives? Do you call them sinners? Do you excommunicate them? Do you not let them into the church because they have more than one wife? And I pointed out, no, polygamy is not a sin. Polygamy is a social evil. It's something bad, it's something that shouldn't happen, but it's not something that you'd necessarily condemn and excommunicate someone for. I mean, we don't really have to deal with that problem in Australia because polygamy is not legal. It's still criminalised in Australia. But with the way things are going, with the legalising of gay marriage, it's very possible that polygamy will be legalised in the future. And we have to really ask the question, what do we do if we have members that are polygamous? Now, as I pointed out in that video, you wouldn't want your existing members to go and participate in such a social evil and take on second wives. But if people had already married multiple women before converting to Christianity, we wouldn't ask them to divorce their latter wives or refuse them to come and join our church just because they've got multiple wives. I then did another video on the whole topic of sin versus social evil, explaining that whole theological topic. But this has prompted someone to ask me a question about, what about polyandry? What about a situation in which there is a woman who marries multiple men? And basically, there is no examples of this in Scripture. It just never happens. There was no situation mentioned in Scripture where a woman had multiple husbands, at least not at one time. And I think this really stems from the Christian worldview of marriage and what it represents. See, in marriage, the wife is the body and the husband is the head. Now, you can't have multiple heads on a body. So therefore, you can't have a marriage in which there are multiple heads. I mean, this is the issue, that if the husband is the head of the household, if there are multiple husbands in the household, who's the head? Now, some people may say, well, how about with polygamy, you can have one head but multiple bodies? Well, yeah, I can see that too. That's why monogamy is the way God intended it. One head, one body. But it is possible, like in the case of King David, he is the head of his household and he has multiple wives. They make up the body of the family. Because actually in the relationship of husband being the head and the wife being the body, actually in a family, children are considered part of the body. And this is all because that the marriage and the family is to be a mirror of the church. Christ is the head of the church, and all the members of the church, all the humans, are then part of the body. There are multiple members that make up the one body. And so too with the Christian family, there is one head, the father, and multiple members that make up the body, being the wife and the children. So it is possible to have multiple wives and multiple children. Not what God intended, but is possible. Whereas with polyandry, it's just not possible because you can't have multiple heads. Again, going back to what I pointed out, the family and marriage is meant to be a reflection of Christ and the church. The church does not have multiple heads. The church has one head, Christ. Therefore, a family cannot have multiple heads. The family must have one head, husband. So in that case, I would say that polyandry would be considered more sinful. It's something that's just not, biblically speaking, possible. You can have a situation in which a man has multiple wives, as seen in Scripture with the cases of the patriarchs and the kings, but you can't have a situation in Scripture, in which there is one woman with multiple husbands. It just doesn't work. I mean, it also goes into the idea of the purposes of marriage, that there are generally 3 biblical reasons for marriage. 4 when you consider what Paul talks about. The first 3 reasons for marriage are your companionship, the reflection of Christ in his church, and of course, creation of new life. There is also the 4th reason for marriage, which is introduced after the fall, and that is to control sexual passions, that you get married so that you don't fall into sexual promiscuity. Now, we go back to that 3rd point there, that the 3rd reason for why we have marriage is for procreation, for producing more life. Now, if you have a man who has multiple wives, he can sleep with each one of those wives and produce a child for each one of those relationships. Such as like King David had like a dozen wives, and each of those wives had their own children. You have also Jacob and his 2 wives and his 2 maidservants. He had children with each of those 4 women. But if you had a situation where there's one woman and like a dozen husbands, she can only have a child with one man at one time. It kind of then makes those other husbands irrelevant. So, no, I'm going to say polyandry is not something that is applicable. It's not something that agrees with Scripture. Now, I'm just want to clarify, I'm not a supporter of polygamy. I take Luther's position that it should be something that is discouraged. I'd never recommend it. But at the same time, if I read the Scriptures, it is not something I can condemn. However, when it comes to polyandry, that is having multiple husbands, that is definitely something I would condemn, because that just is something that clearly goes against God's design with marriage in Scripture. Now, polygamy goes against God's original design for marriage, but it was something that God allowed and God permits. But polyandry is not something that God allows or permits. So I hope that answers the question on the topic of polyandry, and hopefully after this video I'll let this topic die and we can stop talking about polygamy and polyandry. So unless anyone's got more questions on the topic. I'm happy to answer any questions people ask, but that's kind of the last I've got to say on this topic. So I've been your host, Reverend Jake Zabel. Goodbye and God bless.